Good evening, everybody. Welcome. Please come on in and have a seat. Students, if you have a sign-up sheet to do, they will close down now and they'll be open again when Q&A concludes at the end and you can sign up then. So please come grab a seat. I'm Ben Powell, I'm the director of the Free Market Institute here at Texas Tech University. And before I introduce tonight's speaker in just a moment, I want to say just briefly what we have planned for the semester, as this is our first of 3 public events that we're having. The next one will be later in March to coincide with the 5th anniversary of 15 Days to Flatten the Curve, where we'll have Martin Kulldorff here talking about lessons from COVID afterwards. He was one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. We might have another special guest too, but there's kind of a pending appointment for him that makes his schedule in flux for the moment. I'll know more on that later, but at a minimum Martin will be here. It should be very good to hear from. And then our final event of the semester will be with Abby Hall on her book, How to Run Wars, and that'll be later in April 23rd. Hopefully we'll see more of you at these 2 events. I'm particularly excited with the one coming up with Martin. It should be very interesting. He was a professor at Harvard Medical School and got fired over his COVID views. But before we get to those, we have an excellent program planned for tonight with Sam Gregg. Sam Gregg is the Frederick Hayek Chair in Economics and Economic History at the American Institute for Economic Research. He has a Doctor of Philosophy in Moral Philosophy and Political Economy from Oxford University and an MA in Political Philosophy from the University of Melbourne. He has written many academic journal articles and is also a regular writer of opinion pieces in the popular press, publishing in places such as the Wall Street Journal, Foreign Affairs, and Daily Telegraph. His research has also been cited widely, including in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, and The New Yorker. In 2024, he was awarded the prestigious Bradley Prize. The Bradley Prize honors scholars and practitioners whose accomplishments reflect the Bradley Foundation's mission to restore, strengthen, and protect the principles and institutions of American exceptionalism. He is the author of 17 books, including On Ordered Liberty, The Commercial Society, and The Next American Economy, Nation, State, and Markets in an Uncertain World, which is what he's here to talk to us about tonight. Please join me in welcoming Sam Gregg.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Powell. It's a great thing for me to be here at in Texas, and at the Free Market Institute. It's an honor to be here, to be with you tonight, to talk about my book, but also I suspect some of the questions that we've all been thinking about for quite some time when it comes to the future economic development and direction of the United States. So last year, Ben asked me if I'd come down and talk about my book, The Next American Economy. And it made me realize that it's been out for 2.5 years, which is eternity. Those of you who know about books, that's eternity. But I'm still being asked to give presentations and talks and to write about it as well. And I don't think that has very much to do with me per se. I think that has a lot more to do with the topic and the subject matter and what is on a lot of Americans' minds, regardless of where you fit along the political spectrum. Now, I first got involved in these discussions, I suppose about 2015, when I started to notice that what I had thought was a relative consensus about the place of free markets in America and American political economy was starting to slip. I think you can go back, for example, to the 1990s, where you had a relative consensus, I think, starting to develop around things like trade liberalization, reducing government involvement in the economy, a degree of skepticism about the welfare state, etc. Not just on the center-right, but even on the center-left. I mean, I look back now, I don't know about some of you, but I look back at Bill Clinton and I think, you know, in terms of economic policy, not bad in some respects. I never thought I'd say that, by the way, but I just did. But my big journey into this debate began in December 2016, which seems like a long time ago.
What a hum.
But I was on a panel I was on a panel at a conference in London with the late Sir Roger Scruton, the conservative philosopher, and a French economist. The topic was the EU, so we're all sitting there bashing the EU. But the discussion very, very quickly gravitated towards another event that had happened a mere 3 weeks before, which of course was Donald J. Trump's election as the 45th President of the United States. So inevitably the question was asked, so what does this mean for America's stance vis-a-vis the rest of the world? And I had a lot of things that I could have said about that, but I said, well, it seems to me that what it really means for many of us is that it is the first time in a long time that we have had a skeptic about free trade in the White House. If there's anything consistent about President Trump, it is he's always been on the protectionist side of that particular debate. Now at that point, the French economist turned to me and she said, well, I used to think that free trade was basically a fait accompli. Apparently it isn't, she said. We took too much for granted. Well, as it turns out, it wasn't just free trade that was taken for granted. It was a systematic questioning of the place of free markets that was underway, a questioning that we hadn't really seen to that extent and in such depth for a very long time. And of course, it wasn't just coming from those who describe themselves as progressives or people on the left who want to see the state do more in the economy in general. Some of the most prominent and articulate critics of free markets were on the political right. In fact, in some cases, positions being advocated by some conservatives, whether it's things like protectionism, industrial policy, mandating the presence of worker representatives, otherwise known as trade union officials, on the boards of companies. Some of these positions being articulated by, for example, the person who's now the Secretary of State of the United States, closely resembled positions on economic policy issues that were more or less the same as someone as progressive as the senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren. So you saw the emergence of a type of new consensus emerging on the left, on the right, and people were converging around a much more interventionist type of agenda. So clearly, the US economy's future direction was up for grabs to an extent that had not been evident for quite some time, which is why I ended up writing the book. But let's step back a minute in time. So if you look at the period really between, I suppose, the very late 1970s, when some people would argue that parts of the free market agenda began with President Jimmy Carter when he did things like deregulate the airline industry, between 1980 and 2008, I think that the case for free enterprise, more competition, deregulation, more skepticism about government intervention in the economy, and a type of commitment to trade liberalization had really put interventionists, whether they're on the right or on the left, very much on the defense. Now, of course, as with all these things, there was a gap. In fact, there was a huge gap between the rhetoric, the free market rhetoric that you heard about these questions, and actual policy. Pretty big gap between the two things. But nonetheless, there was, I think, over time, in that period, a more or less solid consensus that had gravitated around the idea that markets were more efficient than interventionism, that economic liberty was more important than concerns for particular types of equality, and a type of skepticism had emerged and to a certain extent had captured the minds of people when it came to reassessing things like the Great Society programs of the 1960s or the New Deal programs of the 1930s. But that consensus, I think, really started disintegrating around about 2015. Though I do think that signs of this had been there all along for anyone who had eyes to see and ears to hear, going all the way back to Pat Buchanan's campaign for the Republican nomination for president in 1992. Whereas some of you who are old enough to remember, he was advocating for protectionism, he was arguing that economic globalization was literally costing the lives of Americans. Does this sound familiar to us today?
No.
It should. It should very much sound very clear to us. And I think the reasons why this broke down are many, and I spent quite a bit of time in the first chapters of the book talking about this particular breakdown and why it happened. And some of them are things like the narrative that emerged to explain the 2008 financial crisis. Now, I could sit here all day and talk to you about why I think the financial crisis of 2008 was very much a result of bad monetary policy, as well as mistakes made by the federal government from the 1990s, especially when it came to things like the housing market, etc. I could give you all that argument, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't really matter because the narrative that won the debate, at least in the public imagination and in the public square, was that the 2008 crisis was a result of too much deregulation, over-exuberant markets, and a type of emergence of a capitalism that was oblivious to limits, to constraints, etc. So that was the argument that won the debate, at least publicly. But there are also other things that started to emerge over time that I think changed some people's minds about developed markets. One, of course, and I get asked about this all the time, and I write about it a lot in the book, is the rise of China. The rise of China and what that has meant in terms of what it says to us about the effects of trade liberalization upon the politics of countries. If you go back to the late 1990s when there was a debate in America about whether China should be admitted to the WTO, you can look at statements made by William Jefferson Clinton and George W. Bush sort of arguing that if China entered the WTO, the fuller access to global markets would have a political effect upon the regime in China, and they would sort of more or less start to become just like us. You read the statements, they're very careful about what they say, but there is this underlying undertone of economic liberty will automatically, over time, inexorably produce more political liberty. Well, that didn't happen. We know that, of course. So part of the book dwells in more detail about why this consensus broke down and the different forces that were underlying it, some of which have to do with what public choice economists will talk about when it comes to incentives. Others reflect longer-term political dynamics. Because if you go back in American history, you realize that something like free trade versus protectionism has long been almost baked into the DNA of American political debate. If you go back to the 19th century, the subject that most divided the United States throughout the 19th century, after slavery, was the argument about tariffs. You can look at the history of the United States in this period, and you see incredible debates between regions and political parties about free trade versus tariffs. So I spent time talking about that and some of the longer-term dynamics and the pendulum, how the pendulum has swung back, regrettably in my view, towards a protectionist position on both sides of politics. But I also asked questions about what's at stake. What's at stake with this particular debate in the here and now? And what's at stake, I think, is the fact that the US economy, certainly, I think, really over the past 10 years, has moved more and more in the direction of what I'll call state capitalism. State capitalism. Because people say, well, we're sort of moving in a socialist direction. I don't think that's quite right. I think state capitalism is a better way of describing one possible future for the United States right now, economically speaking. So what's state capitalism? Well, state capitalism is an economy in which institutions like private property and relatively free exchange are certainly maintained in place, but it's also an economy in which government programs and regulation permeate virtually every sector of economic life, and politically speaking, a situation in which we put more and more faith, not in markets, but in what I'll call technocrats and bureaucrats. Faith in them to try and engineer specific economic outcomes that they are not confident would be delivered by markets alone. So this is despite all the documented failures and all the dysfunctionalities that I think are associated with state capitalism. Unfortunately, I think we're moving in that direction. So I think state capitalism more or less accurately describes the state of the American economy today. But I also think that today is what I'll call market skeptics of free markets. They want us at the moment to go even further down this particular path. They're also not above spinning mythologies to try and promote this goal. So we've been informed by some people on the political right, for instance, that Adam Smith did not extend his free trade principles beyond national boundaries. Now, anyone here who's read The Wealth of Nations knows that's simply not true. But when you point this out to some of the people on the right who are arguing this, they smile and they just keep saying this over and over and over again. It's the Goebbels principle, as I like to call it. On the other hand, on the other side of politics, we have some progressives who are telling us that the New Deal was actually a marvelous thing that saved America. And this is despite now what I think is mountains of empirical evidence suggesting that the New Deal didn't, in fact, get the United States out of depression at all. So those are some of the historical mythologies which have resurfaced and have been popularized very effectively by supporters of what I'm calling state capitalism and skeptics of free markets. Now, I could go on and on and on, and I do in the book, about the falseness of these arguments. But I thought what I might do this evening is focus a little on the issue that I think captures much of the debate that America is going through right now when it comes to the future of the American economy. And I think that of all the economic issues that have split Americans over the past almost 10 years now, I think trade is perhaps the most prominent and the most divisive of these issues. So the skepticism that you hear from old-style progressives about free trade is very much shared by a lot of conservative Americans today. They even invoke very similar rhetoric when they're trying to make some of their arguments. We're told, for example, by people on the left and on the right that economic globalization has left people behind. We're told that it's devastated manufacturing. One of the great lines you hear is, "We don't build things anymore." We hear this all the time from people on the right, but also on the left as well. Now, all these claims, I think, are very, very questionable. So let's take, for example, manufacturing. This is one of the things that we hear people on the conservative right and parts of the progressive left talk about all the time. So they say, well, manufacturing and unemployment levels have collapsed. We're no longer a leading country in the world when it comes to manufacturing. Well, it's true that manufacturing employment declined from 19 million, I think it was in 1979, which is the peak of manufacturing employment in America, to about 12 million in 2016. It's probably about 13 million now. But what we don't hear said is that for every net job that's been lost in manufacturing over the past 30 years, 8 new jobs have been created in the service sector. And that includes a net addition of 19 million jobs in sectors that typically pay a lot more than manufacturing. In fact, OECD numbers show that real manufacturing production in America grew by 180% between 1972 and 2019, and between 2000 and 2021, real manufacturing value added in America rose by 36% to a record $2.56 trillion. Those are pretty amazing numbers. Another thing to keep in mind is that we are still in the top 3, by the various indices that measure these things, America is still one of the top 3 manufacturing countries in the world. What we do is specialize in high-tech manufacturing because that's what we're good at. It doesn't make sense for us to build cars as if it's the 1950s anymore. We also don't hear that one of the reasons, in fact, the major reason, the overwhelming reason for the decline in numbers working in manufacturing doesn't have that much to do with trade. It's got everything to do with technology. Technology has simply replaced many of the laborious, physically tiring and repetitive jobs that used to be done by people in the 1950s, 1960s, and into the 1970s. So there's a whole different story that needs to be told about manufacturing in the context of these debates about trade. But, as I mentioned before, I think the endless repetition of false claims about manufacturing, and false claims about a lot of other topics, which we can maybe talk about in the Q&A, has certainly made an impact upon the way that a lot of Americans think about something like free trade. In fact, if you look at the numbers by political background or political alignment, the groups that are most skeptical of free trade turn out to be independents and Republicans. Democrats tend to be the ones who are more in favor of free trade. Now, why that is the case? I think it's partly because Trump's a protectionist, therefore they're in favor of free trade. I think that's part of the political dynamic that's going on. I'm not naive, I think, about how people react politically with many of these things. But it does present a major challenge for those of us who believe in things like free trade. How does one rehabilitate the case for free trade among Americans? How does one rehabilitate the case for free markets in general among the American populace? Because it's one thing to have what you might call elites on your side when it comes to some of these issues. But we've discovered over the past 10 years that topics like trade have a populist dimension to it. And that is a very, very powerful thing that no amount of elite consensus around a particular issue is often very capable of resisting, as we've discovered over the past few election cycles. So what does one do? If you're a free trader, if you're a free marketer, how does one push back against this continuing drive towards state capitalism that takes often different forms on the left and the right, but sometimes the same form on the left and the right? So I have lots of thoughts about this particular subject, so I'll just offer you a few for your consideration. So first of all, and I think most obvious, those of us who are free marketers have to engage economic nationalists and economic policy debates. By that I mean that a lot of economic nationalists want to talk about other things. They want to talk about what's going on in the culture. They want to talk about foreign policy and things like that. Now those are discussions that definitely need to be had, but at the same time I do think some of the central economic claims made by economic nationalists need to be directly engaged and refuted. So that means, among other things, promoting the type of rigorous economics that has long shown, for example, that protectionism is something that's highly problematic, certainly on an economic level. That it produces things like cronyism, that it leads to massive misallocations of capital throughout the economy, that the people who pay the price for tariffs the people whose government has imposed them on someone else. In other words, American consumers are the ones who will pay the higher tariffs. What's good about this is that there's broad consensus in the economic literature about this. Now, those of you who are the professional economists in the audience will tell you, correct me if I'm wrong, that if there's one thing that economists agree about, whatever their political allegiance, it tends to be that free trade works and protectionism doesn't. So there's a remarkable consensus around that. But we can also point to particular examples to show how protectionism is economically bad for Americans and the United States. So some of you probably heard this week that the Trump administration is doing all sorts of things with tariffs, including with steel and aluminium. Some of you have probably been following that. But let me take you back to March 2018, when the Trump administration first increased tariffs on steel and aluminium imports. Well, it didn't take long before a 2019 Federal Reserve analysis estimated that while these tariffs may have saved approximately 5,000 jobs in steel and aluminium production industry, they had also resulted in a net loss of approximately 75,000 jobs. 75,000 jobs in industries that use steel and use aluminium. And most of those jobs, it turns out, were not white-collar jobs. They were blue-collar jobs in blue-collar towns. So that's a really good illustration of how a policy that is often dressed up in terms of this is how we save American workers, this is how we look after the working class, actually did enormous damage in terms of raw numbers to particular industries where there is a lot of blue-collar employment going on. That's the type of evidence, I think, that those of us who are involved in these debates need to stress over and over and over again. Second, I think we also have to explain what a full-throated embrace of protectionism, which is really what we're going through now, at least politically, would mean for America. So as I mentioned, it would mean higher prices, something that hurts less wealthy Americans. Richer Americans can absorb the cost of poor Americans find it a lot more. Means, I think, an America that's cowering behind tariff walls, pretending that people abroad aren't willing to work as hard or even harder than Americans. It means also deluding ourselves that a group of technocrats working in the Treasury Department or the Department of Commerce can know somehow how to engineer the optimal makeup of a $30 trillion economy via things like tariffs, via things like industrial policy. This is what Hayek called the knowledge problem. This sort of this belief that somehow the government, Politburo, a cabinet, a government department, somehow has the the capacity to sort of see what's going to be the optimal makeup of the American economy, not just now, but in 2 months' time, 3 months' time, 1 year's time, 10 years' time. Third, I think we need to recognize that many of the attacks on free markets today are being made not just on economic grounds, they're also being made on historical and political premises. So I think it follows that those of us who believe in free markets have to counter these types of theses very much on the same terrain. We need to show, for example, that the American system of the first half of the 19th century, something that economic nationalists and interventionists constantly point to as what they call an example of successful industrial policy, successful government management of the economy, turns out to have been a colossal failure and a massive boost and stimulus for cronyism among the political class of both parties. We also need to remind people of just how much damage, historically speaking, things like tariffs have done to the American economy. Think, for example, the 1930 Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act, which did tremendous damage to the American economy at the worst possible time. Not only did it produce lots of cronyism, it also produced massive retaliation from abroad at a time when America could least afford that type of retaliation, and which at a time when America desperately needed access to foreign markets to which it could export lots of goods and services. So in other words, countering some of these things requires good economics, but I think it requires good economic history, and frankly, good history overall. Fourth, I think we need to make the positive case for free trade. Those of us who do economics or political economy, particularly if we're on the free market side, we're pretty good at pointing out the flaws of interventionism. No, that's a bad idea. No, that's a silly policy. Don't do that. But we need to make a positive case for these things as well. The economic nationalists are very good at making positive, affirming cases for their positions. I think free marketers need to do the same as well. So, for example, we need to show that thanks to trade liberalization, Americans are economically better off by numerous economic measures. So this means, for example, explaining that, for example, trade liberalization contributes to something that I think we sometimes take for granted, which is economic growth. The evidence for this, I think, is frankly overwhelming. The most recent World Bank study of trade and growth showed that trade liberalization increases economic growth by an average of 1.5 percentage points, which translates into a 15% higher incomes over a 10-year period. That's a great number. Here's another good number. The latest IMF report on trade estimated that, quote, a 1 percentage point increase in trade openness raises per capita income by 4%. That's nothing to sneeze at. So these are very practical benefits of trade liberalization for ordinary Americans. Speaking of ordinary Americans, trade liberalization also increases the value of American workers' real wages. Why? Because they can buy more goods and services, because these things have become less expensive thanks to trade liberalization. Moreover, as the real prices start to fall, Americans can shift their consumption from necessities towards more discretionary spending. So in the 1950s, for example, so this is really when trade liberalization is only starting to take off after the Second World War. In the 1950s, American households spent a combined 34.5% of their income on basic necessities like food, clothing, and fuel. 50 years later, that number had gone from 34% to 13%. That's an amazing achievement, and trade liberalization is part of that story. Now third, and this is sometimes a harder part, trade liberalization definitely means more competition from abroad. Now, there's going to be plenty of Americans who will say, well, that worries me. I'm not sure I want more competition from abroad. I actually think we need lots of competition from abroad, and trade liberalization helps to deliver that. I say that because I think trade liberalization makes American businesses more resilient and more adaptable. The bigger and wider the competition, the more that American businesses are subject to unrelenting pressures to innovate, to reassess their comparative advantage, to streamline their organization, to shrink their costs, to lower their prices. These are all good things. These are good things for the competitiveness of the American economy. And you can also look at those sectors of the economy that have gone down the other path and played the subsidies and protection game. Just go to Detroit. Just look at outfits like US Steel. These are not what we would call flourishing examples of American business. And these are precisely the parts of the American economy that have been most benefited by, in terms of getting subsidies and protection from the American government. It has very bad effects on the long-term competitiveness of these industries. So, I could say a lot more about the economic benefits of free trade, But there's one thing I want to emphasize. So I've just made a type of positive case for free trade in terms of its benefits for America and Americans. So I do think we need to spend more time focusing upon these types of benefits. Because I think a lot of Americans don't think about the ways in which they benefit from these types of policies. I think a lot of Americans have very have to have the whole argument for free trade explained to them because it's not immediately obvious to them. And I think sometimes one of the things that free marketers do is we spend a lot of time looking at graphs, showing diagrams, getting big numbers, etc. And that's all very important. It's very important to understand that at macro level, that free trade boosts growth, and that in people's everyday lives they can see this, the effects of free trade in terms of lower prices. It's just what I did. But what do economic nationalists do? How do they deal with these things? Well, what they do is something that's very rhetorically effective. They point down the road and say, look, the local factory that's been there forever has just closed down. People have lost their jobs. Suddenly families don't have a breadwinner. That's a very rhetorically effective argument. Very, very effective and rhetorical argument. And you hear today's economic nationalists taking examples like that and saying, see, this is what's wrong with economic globalization. This is what's wrong with free trade. This is why we need subsidies and protections. But I happen to think that there's no reason why free traders can't also play that type of game. Free traders should be showing how protectionism and industrial policy, using these things to try and reverse decline in communities like Youngstown, Ohio, which is the classic example, have failed again and again and again and again. Free traders can also point to those towns that protectionists never talk about. Towns like Beaumont, Texas, or Greenville, South Carolina, or Danville, Virginia, or Hickory, North Carolina, or Grand Rapids, Michigan. Why should we talk about those towns? We should talk about those towns because these are towns that faced up to the reality of competition from abroad and shifted the focus of what they did. Workers in these towns learned the skills that are needed, for example, by advanced manufacturing firms. In other words, people adapted. They didn't pretend that life could just go on the way it had always been. And that story, by the way, is a lot more common, I think, than most people realize. So back in 2018, there was an analysis published of how older industrial towns in America's Northeast and Midwest had fared since the 1970s. So of the 180 counties that were identified as having a disproportionate share of manufacturing jobs in 1970, this study showed that about 115 had successfully switched away from low-skill manufacturing towards other industries. And of the other 70, 40 had exhibited strong or emerging economic performance and were well down the path to transforming themselves. Now, was it easy? No. Was there turmoil? Yes. Was the transition difficult for some people? Of course. But what was the alternative? The alternative was Youngstown, Ohio. Staying stuck, pretending that you could just live the same way over and over again, in a sense that you were owed a living, that you were entitled to live this way for the rest of your life, and pretend that other Americans weren't effectively subsidizing that through subsidies or tariffs or any of these things that ultimately cost ordinary Americans money. So there are good stories to tell. There are good stories to tell about how American towns have taken advantage of economic globalization and free trade and adapted and done relatively well. But we also have to show, I think, that America can promote these types of policies, trade liberalization, in a manner that's cognizant of 21st century political realities. And the reason is that these types of economic arguments never occur in a political vacuum. Free trade, for example, requires substantial domestic support if it's going to be sustained against the armies of rent seekers and their lobbyists out there who are seeking privileges. So that's one thing. Then there's the fact that in the real world, trade policy is notoriously hard to separate out from foreign policy. Debates about American trade policy have always involved reflection on the actions and policies of other powerful countries, whether it's, for example, 19th century Britain or 21st century communist China. Now, as I mentioned before, back in the 1990s, arguments for trade liberalization became associated with widespread hopes for a more harmonious world after the fall of communism. Yes, there were appeals to national interests that were made. Nonetheless, a lot of the speechifying by political leaders at the time often had a type of perpetual peace tone to them. It wasn't hard to find American policymakers arguing that trade liberalization would almost inevitably spark political liberalization abroad. Now, I think in the aftermath of the Cold War, the euphoria, we beat the commies, we won, etc., these types of sentiments were very understandable. And it's certainly true that trade liberalization reduces the incentives and often the calculus of people when they're thinking about peace rather than war. It certainly, I think, encourages more peaceful tendencies, but it doesn't guarantee it. That's the one caveat I'd add. International politics, of course, has changed a lot since the 1990s. China, for example, has become more authoritarian, more aggressive in its dealings with other nations, and it's become less market-oriented. It's developed its own version of state capitalism. In other words, free marketers in America can't ignore some of these major geopolitical developments. Whether we like it or not, we live in a world in which issues of national sovereignty, national cohesion, and national identity have become very key reference points, whether we like it or not. Questions like, who are my people? Or where do I belong? Have become omnipresent. And I think if free traders and market liberals in general don't think about how they can address these questions in a way that's consistent with market principles and ideas and what we know about the economy, then no matter how good the economic arguments we make, I think we end up losing. So, having thoroughly depressed you, how does one proceed? Well, I think we should proceed, as Indiana Jones once said, wisely. So by that I mean several things. First of all, I think we should try and continue the type of multilateralism associated with the WTO. Multilateral agreements are important because simultaneously lowering trade barriers of all WTO countries increases the overall volume of trade and thus produces greater economic gains than bilateral arrangements do. But we also know that multilateralism hasn't yielded a lot of fruit in recent years. Since the WTO replaced the GATT in 1995, we've had just two multilateral agreements. But we can pursue what are often called plurilateral agreements. That means a subset of the WTO's 164 members agreeing on new trade commitments and then offering other WTO members opportunities to enter the agreement at a future date. That's one way for America to promote trade liberalization in a context in which multilateralism seems to have stalled. Second, and this is much more difficult actually, free traders need to get better, much better, at showing how pursuing free trade need not compromise national security. Because national security is on a lot of Americans' minds, including the minds of a lot of free marketers. So two general points. First of all, free traders from Adam Smith onwards have always acknowledged that genuine national security concerns are a legitimate exception. Genuine military needs trump trade. But there's a second point. Flimsy appeals to national security have become too often a basis for interest groups seeking protectionism. And there's no shortage of examples. So back in 2019, our friends at the Commerce Department tried to label the practice of car companies outsourcing the production and assembling of car parts to Mexico and Canada as a threat to national security. I kid you not. Here's a direct quote from the relevant Commerce Department document. Quote, "The Secretary determined that national security includes the general security and welfare of certain industries beyond those necessary to satisfy national defense requirements." So think about that. That amounts to a license for any administration to invoke national security as the basis for curtailing free trade in areas of the American economy that have nothing to do with national security. So we have a needle to thread between genuine national security issues and fake national security issues. And no case exemplifies that better challenge than China, and that's why the words China, Chinese, and CCP are mentioned a combined total of 210 times in the book. Other things I think we have to do is we have to be much more measured about what free trade can and cannot do for America. We have to acknowledge certain realities about the geopolitical sphere while also making the case that free trade's positives and protectionism's negatives are of no benefit for the United States in the long term and no benefit for national security. There's lots of other things we could do. We could talk about the way in which we deal with Chinese businesses operating in America. Those that don't obey the law should be subject to the same laws as everyone else, etc. In fact, there's lots of challenges in this area, and last year I ended up writing an entire white paper on the topic of free trade and national security because I wanted to look at the different issues involved, and I wanted to think about how you advance a free trade agenda in such a difficult environment. And one thing to keep in mind, of course, is that China's economy itself is facing a lot of major difficulties. The evidence is growing that Chinese-style state capitalism and the political and economic dysfunctionalities associated with it is creating immense difficulties for China. Wasted investments, exacerbated by things like growing corruption, declining productivity, a property market in crisis, and of course a massive self-inflicted demographic implosion. So, let's conclude. I think the case of China illustrates that the path towards trade liberalization, of rehabilitating the case for free markets, is complicated, it's sometimes torturous, and it always concerns within the context of politics. That's why promoting market liberalism is never-ending, why it's full of setbacks, and why many of the principles of market liberalism remain a goal that will be pursued with the full realization that the goal will probably never be fully realized as long as humans are human. But for all the challenges associated with advancing the case for markets in America today, one thing is very clear. Giving in to economic nationalism would inflict grave economic and political damage upon the United States. That, I think, is ultimately what's at stake. Market liberalism may be very hard to sell these days, but market liberalism, I think, does help make America a more competitive, a more prosperous, and ultimately, and perhaps most importantly, a much freer people. And that, I think, is a goal that's worth pursuing. Thank you very much.